Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly chat about local history. Thanks again for joining me. I'm Robert Lowell Goller. This week's topic came from some folks who've been asking me questions. Actually, it was interesting that I got it from more than one person. And then several months ago, I saw someone ask about it on social media, which I found interesting, the timing that multiple people were asking about it. And I take for granted that people know the answer, and I think a lot of us who work in the field of history in East Aurora and the Roycroft just take for granted that the answer to this question that everyone knows. But if you were someone from another town, another state, another planet landing in East Aurora, and you saw a statue, a sculpture of Michelangelo, you'd wonder why the heck is there a sculpture of Michelangelo in the village of East Aurora, in this little village, when he was over in, Europe, and during the Renaissance, the High Renaissance. What the heck what's his connection to East Aurora? And it's a great question. Of course, I love great questions like that. And it kind of brought me back a little bit because, again, I always just assume people know why that statue is there, why that sculpture is there, and it has a very interesting history. Because a lot of other sculptures we have in town, Albert Hubbard in front of the middle school, we'll talk about him and that sculpture in connection to the Michelangelo sculpture. Now we have one to Millard Fillmore. There's another one of Albert Hubbard. Those folks had connections to East Aurora. Albert Hubbard, of course, lived here in East Aurora, built the Roycroft here. Millard Fillmore lived here for about 10 years, built his house here. So there are local connections. And you go downtown, there's, a monument to President McKinley because he, was assassinated in the city. And then Grover Cleveland and again, Millard Fillmore, they have connections to the community. But Michelangelo, he never would have stepped foot here in East Aurora because there were no pioneer settlers here at the time, and he would never have come over here. He would have been able to come to East Aurora during his lifetime. So why is there a sculpture here? And if you are guessing that it has some sort of connection to the Roycroft, you would be right. And it goes back to Albert Hubbard. Now, Albert Hubbard was a very eccentric person, of course, and he loved his arts and crafts community at Roycroft. And so in the late 1900s, about 1909, he had remembered seeing a sculpture of Michelangelo at the Library of Congress. And the story goes that he wanted one of his own. So he called the sculptor, got in touch with the sculptor. His name was Paul Wayland Bartlett, and asked to commission his own sculpture of Michelangelo to match the one that was in the Library of Congress. Now, you have to remember that Albert Hubbard was a very famous person and had money and knew a lot of people, and so he was able to do this. Not any ordinary person was able to just call up a sculptor and ask to have their sculpture, have a commission of the sculpture. Now, of course, probably the sculptor was very interested in having work and to be able to recreate a sculpture that they liked, that they had done before. So they the sculptor was probably very eager to do this for Albert Hubbard. And now, of course, Albert Hubbard, we have to remember, was really, really famous at the time. So to be able to have a commission from Albert Hubbard would have been a very big deal for the sculptor. Now, an interesting story with this sculpture, the Michelangelo sculpture, is that the artist, the sculptor, was taking too long, according to Albert Hubbard. So Albert Hubbard kept bugging him to get it done. What's going on? Why don't you have this completed yet? And the story goes that Mr. Bartlett sent back a small turtle, sculpture of a turtle, and with a note that said, "Good art takes time." Meaning, lay off me. I'm working as fast as I can, and if you want it done right, it's going to take as long as it's going to take. So the Michelangelo statue was finally completed in 1909, and it was dedicated in May of 1909. And the East Aurora Advertiser actually has a great article on the front page of the newspaper about its dedication. Now, today it's located in the middle school grounds, but originally it was in what is now a grass area again. On the Roycroft campus, right off of South Grove Street, so on the south side of Main Street. and it was facing South Grove Street, and it was dedicated. And an interesting part of that article in the East Aurora Advertiser from May 6, 1909 was explaining why Albert Hubbard wanted a Michelangelo statue, and they actually talked a little bit about how Albert Hubbard admired Michelangelo. Of course, we know Michelangelo from the Sistine Chapel and many other things, is because he was part of a Renaissance, and Albert Hubbard felt like he was part of a Renaissance as well through the work that he was doing, and so he felt a connection to Michelangelo. And they actually refer to Michelangelo, or Michelangelo, as some people say. They refer to him as the patron saint of Roycroft in the article on May 6, 1909 in the East Aurora Advertiser. So to have a sculpture of the patron saint of the Roycroft, as in the eyes of Albert Hubbard, its founder, was a pretty big deal. So they dedicated this sculpture, and it was on the lawn of the Roycroft campus after that. Now, because the Michelangelo statue sits next to a sculpture of Albert Hubbard, a lot of people think that the sculptures were done at the same time or connected, and in fact they are not. After Albert Hubbard and Alice Hubbard died on the Lusitania in 1915, the community and Albert Hubbard II and even Albert Hubbard III as a child, they're actually pictured in a great picture of the dedication of it, but they commissioned a sculpture of Albert Hubbard by the sculptor Jerome Connor, so a different sculptor. Even though they look similar, they're not by the same sculptor. So Jerome Connor did the one of Albert Hubbard that sits on the Roycroft, or on the middle school lawn today, and Paul Bartlett did the one of Michelangelo. Albert Hubbard, the sculpture of Albert Hubbard, was dedicated in 1930, so several years after his death, and it was placed on the Roycroft campus in that grass area, right off of South Grove Street, behind the chapel building, in 1930. So that's when the two sculptures were placed there, which is interesting because if you see some old photographs of the Roycroft campus, you can kind of date them by by the placement, the existence of those sculptures. So anything, if you just see Michelangelo, it's 1909. If you see none, it's before 1909. And if you see both sculptures on the Roycroft campus, it's after 1930. Now, the Roycroft goes bankrupt in the late 1930s, and there was things were getting auctioned off, and there was actually a big concern that these sculptures would go out of the community. They would leave East Aurora, a legitimate concern because a lot of things in the bankruptcy sales were leaving the community, and so there was concern in East Aurora about these sculptures leaving. So the Erie County Trust Company, now Irving Price gets a lot of credit for it, and some other local individuals get credit for saving the sculptures, and it was actually the bank itself. Now the Erie County Trust Company was located, the last bank there was Bank of America, at the corner of Main and Church Streets. They stepped up and bought the sculptures to save them, to keep them in the community. And because the land, the Roycroft campus, was being sold off, they had to find a new location for them. And it's interesting to note that the bankruptcy occurred in the late 1930s of the Roycroft, but the sculptures were allowed to stay there for about a decade. And they were finally moved in 1952 when it became apparent that they needed to move. Because the Roycroft campus became a jigsaw puzzle of ownership, and a lot of Erie County had bought part of the buildings, and there were businesses and different organizations were buying different pieces of the Roycroft campus. So the sculptures were moved across the street onto the middle school, what is today the middle school. It was then the high school, in the courtyard of the middle school, of the high school, today the middle school. And another question that people ask all the time is, why did the school get them? And according to the news reports at the time, the bank and the community leaders that had saved the sculptures wanted to find an organization that would potentially be around forever, in perpetuity. And the school district will not dissolve. That was their theory, that the school district will live on for a very long time, that the sculptures had a educational value, and so the ownership was transferred over to the school in the courtyard of the school. Um, and so that was the theory, that first they didn't want to have to move them too far, so across the street, and second is that the school would be a good caretaker of them, and that it wouldn't be a private business or something that could dissolve, and then we'd be in the same problem again of saving the sculptures again. There had been a movement, because the Roycroft campus is being revitalized, to move them back, and there was a community debate about it, but and that they should be in the original location on the Roycroft campus. Uh, that's certainly beneficial. The other side of the coin is the argument is that they have actually been on the campus of the middle school longer than they were over at the Roycroft campus. And also, if people are walking by, I know on walking tours, and if you're talking about the sculptures, their location on the middle school campus is actually a great opportunity to talk about the bankruptcy and talk about how the Roycroft during the Great Depression went bankrupt, the Roycroft Renaissance movement after that. So it leads to a discussion about that part of the story of Roycroft. I see both sides of it, but their location on the middle school campus actually can lend itself to that discussion, talking about the bankruptcy and how the community saved various aspects of the Roycroft. And that's an interesting argument on why they are at the middle school. So that's why we have a statue of Michelangelo in East Aurora, and why they're located over on the middle school grounds. Now, that little when I said that the sculptor Paul Bartlett had sent Albert Hubbard a little turtle to say, good art takes time. That little turtle was placed on the base of the base of the sculpture, and with a little note. And story goes that it went missing back in the 50s, the 1950s, and the story was that a rival school had stolen it. And was holding it for ransom. Whether or not that's true, there have been stories that it had been found. There were photos of it. There were replicas made of it, I believe, for the family, Hubbard family, and things. So there are others that are not the original one. But as a class gift, as one of their reunions during the night, one of the classes from the 1950s actually gifted a replica of that original turtle, and that's what's on the base of the sculpture today, not the original turtle, which we don't, as far as I know where that went. So that's why, that's the story of the turtle. We have a replacement turtle there, and that was done about 20 years ago, I believe, as part of a reunion where they rededicated the turtle that the sculptor had sent to Albert Hubbard to tell him to, hold your horses. I'm working on this. I'm working on this sculpture, and it's going to take time to do it right. So that's why we have a sculpture of Michelangelo in East Aurora. One of the interesting things is that Albert Hubbard wrote an essay about the Michelangelo statue, and he titled it "He Faces East." And you can look this up. It's available on the internet as something that Albert Hubbard wrote. But interestingly, when the sculptures were moved over to Main Street on the grounds of the middle school, they were placed facing south. So He Faces East now faces south, which is just another interesting part of the history. So Michelangelo, who was referred to in an Albert Hubbard essay as He Faces East, is now facing south. Just a little bit of interesting trivia. So I hope that answers the question. I've written a lot about the sculptures, and they will be included in an upcoming book that I'm working on about Roycroft history. But there's a fascinating history of the timeline of these sculptures. And even though they look like they were possibly done by the same sculptor, at least to a layman who is not adept at of the art forms of sculptures, professionals could tell the difference. But they may look alike, but they weren't done by the same sculptor, and they weren't done at the same time. So two different sculptors, two different time periods, but they're both on the lawn of the middle school today. Again, thank you for this great idea. Either you sending me the ideas either through private message or in the comments. So feel free to do that for future topics. Thank you again for supporting this project. Yes, I am the Town and Village Historian, but these videos and a lot of my research are not affiliated with my official duties as Town and Village Historian. So thank you for supporting this project. Thank you for keeping the comments and the topic ideas coming. And as always, thank you for keeping history alive. We'll see you next time. Take care.